It's great to have you on Conversations with Therapists. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I feel like I've heard a lot about your practice, and it's exciting for me to kind of like delve a little bit deeper. And I guess I want to start just by asking you if you can tell us a bit about your journey and what led you to specialize in substance use and addiction recovery and how you kind of got into the field.
So I've been in practice for almost 10 years. Can be a little tricky to decide at what point you're counting from because I was in a few different programs. One of the programs that I was in was at the new school, and it was not quite what I had in mind. It was a lot more research focused, and one of the clinical options they had was to focus on substance abuse. So that being the opportunity that was afforded to me to have more of that emphasis on clinical work, I went on that track. That got me more interested. I saw that there was really a need in the field for having different kind of approaches and getting out of some of the standard frameworks and uh, emphases that were placed. It's something that I've had gotten more experience with and is a really integral part of my practice.
You talked a little bit about like the standard way of looking at substance use and addiction recovery versus how you look at it. Can you explain a little bit deeper about what the standard way is and how your approach is different?
So this is something that I did get from that track at the new school. They employ a harm reduction approach to substance abuse and addiction. And harm reduction, there's a lot of different meanings to it and different ways of implementing it. But it's most contrasted with an abstinence based model. So, in an abstinence based model, the goal is to get the person to the point that they are totally abstinent. They're not using any substances. There is that really stark break between them and the addictive behavior, substance, whatever it is that the focus is on. And the harm reduction approach is looking at how can we, as the name implies, reduce the harm, help to get this problem more manageable. Oftentimes, that for many individuals at many times is going to mean that they're going to be abstinent. But it also integrates working with people that might want to cut down on their substance use. They might be more ambivalent about it. They oftentimes the abstinence-based approach is also prohibited of using other substances because of a concern of compensating or rebounding. So somebody who is wanting to cut down on their drinking or stimulant use is also going to be discouraged, really prohibited in an abstinence-based model from smoking weed, right? Something that they might not feel is a problem for them, or they might not be ready to give up. That's something that uh, to me, it speaks a little bit more at helping people, meeting them where they're at, and not having as much of the projection from the therapist or the clinic or whatever authority party believes that the person should be doing and how they should be approaching the addiction.
I'd love to delve a little bit deeper into that because I think a lot of people know, I guess, a more like conventional, traditional approach to substance use. Like people know about AA, they know about the 12 steps. But specifically, I guess, with your approach and also harm reduction in general, how does it differ? Like if we understand maybe like you just explained sort of like the general way of like how they contrast, but like in your work, what are some examples?
When it comes to in the work, how that looks different, it really is working with the person on what their goals are for therapy, for how they're working with their addiction. And to me, it's very much in line with the foundational therapeutic framework, which is that the client is the one who ultimately takes charge, takes that responsibility, decides how they want to live their values, what they want to prioritize. So that's something that I bring in to all of my work, and particularly with working with those who are struggling with substances or any kind of addiction. And it's one that oftentimes the person doesn't, in many other contexts, really have that as something that's afforded to them. There are a lot of uh, decisions or expectations that don't take into account where that person is at or what specifically they might be struggling with at that time. And there often can be a lot of comments and reactions of, that you're in denial, or you're compensating, or that's enabling. And addiction can be really hard to work with. I can understand and identify with clinicians that feel like they know better than the person, and they've seen it either through their own experience or through working with others of what works and what doesn't work. But I really do believe that that's something that is ultimately powerful when that person comes to that realization on their own, when that motivation to change and to take charge is really internal as opposed to coming from external sources.
That's really interesting. And I feel like also a lot of people, their perception of drug use or substance use is, what they see in the media. And I feel like Schiffer was saying, a lot of that is focused on like AA and abstinence only. And I feel like with that, there's, the clear goal, there's abstinence. So what do you see as the the healing or the goal for the clients you work with? Is it just them accomplishing whatever goals they've set out in therapy, or is there something more concrete?
So the way that I look at healing is from a broader sense, considering addiction. And this is also a big contrast in terms of the prevailing approach, which is looking at addiction as from a disease model framework, which views addiction really through a medical kind of model, and looking at addiction as a brain disease. There often is the sense that this is something that you're just born with. There's a assumption that it's heritable, that there really isn't anything you could do to get rid of it. And so it's a chronic disease and you're trying to figure out how to manage it, but you're living with it basically for the rest of your life. Somebody with diabetes, they're finding those ways to manage it, to keep it in check. And so the alternative to that is it's referred to as a biopsychosocial framework. It has different names, but basically it's looking at addiction from a multi-layered perspective, that there are those biological influences, but that doesn't tell the whole story. There's also considering the psychological, the social, the history of that person, the early experiences, the trauma, the family life, different things in the culture or their social environment, that all combine and contribute in resulting in this response. That it's one, the addiction, which from this orientation, this way of looking at it, views the addiction as serving a purpose, serving a function. And at this point in the person's life, usually the harms outweigh the good, but it's considering that this is doing something for that person and it is fulfilling a certain role in terms of managing pain, trauma, being dissociative, numbing, uh, something that they can use to feel good. And so when you're looking at it from that perspective, you're focusing more on the underlying wounds and experiences that require this person to be partaking of this substance or this addiction in order to manage the symptoms, the struggles that they've had. So it's looking at healing, that when you are able to get to that pain and tend to those wounds, there no longer is that same need for the addiction, for whatever behavior was manifesting in that way. So as opposed to something chronic like diabetes or some genetic disease, you're able to get to a point, and it's hard and it takes time, and not everybody gets there, but you're able to get to a point where that no longer has the same hold over that person that it did previously.
For those who don't know, maybe I'd love to hear maybe some specific examples of like harm reduction sort of approaches that you use. I'm also assuming that, sometimes people come to your practice and maybe they've tried more conventional things and they're kind of surprised to see, other methods. But I'd love to hear a little bit about what they are.
I would say the thing that stands out the most is making that determination of where that person is at in their journey, with how they are relating to the substance, to the addiction, and considering more about at this time, what are you ready to give up? What is the impact that this behavior, that this addiction is having on you and on others? And what is a way of getting closer to the point that you want to be at with acknowledging that that's something that might shift over time. So it very much is something that's built into setting the goals and really having clarity over the treatment plan and where we're going to go. And it's something that is dynamic. It's something that shifts over time. And so somebody might come in and say that, I'm smoking weed every day and it's really starting to impact me. My memory is getting affected. It's affecting my motivation, starting to feel more anxiety. But the idea of just getting off of it totally is something that is so terrifying for me. It's so overwhelming. I'm not able to do that. I would, as bad as this is, I would rather just continue if those are the only options. Right. So being able to carve out that space of, okay, well, let's see then instead of doing it every day, let's start with doing it every other day and see how that is. And if when that starts to feel manageable, let's shift the target and see about doing it maybe a couple of times a week. And maybe that goes down to once a day, once a week, I should say. And maybe at a certain point, the person feels like, you know what? I think at this time, I'm okay with doing it the once a week or something like that. Right. And that's something we could explore and see what the ramifications of that are, what the consequences are. Another thing that I think really makes a difference in terms of the harm reduction approach is that there is much more of a tolerance and an acknowledgement of somebody who is going to partake of the substance or the behavior. And so from a very strict abstinence only model and framework that a clinician might take, having, let's say, a relapse is looked at as it's a failure. It's not accepted. There are situations even where there might be a therapeutic contract. It doesn't have to literally be a contract, but an expectation that the treatment or the therapy, this is more so if it's strictly mental health, if it's not particularly focused on the substance use aspect, but that there oftentimes is the expectation of you have to be clean in order to be in therapy, in order to do that kind of work together. So this framework allows more openness, more acknowledgement for those times where somebody might have a relapse, and then it's okay, let's regroup, let's consider how did this happen? What were the triggers? What were some of the warning signs maybe that weren't heeded? And how can we take this forward and really be able to make it more of an opportunity for growth and self-understanding and compassion?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder also, maybe you can like answer this as well, is from the medical perspective, I feel like, especially in extreme cases when people go cold turkey with the abstinence model, there's, withdrawal and a lot of other things that could affect the body physically. So is the harm reduction model also maybe safer from that aspect as well?
Well, certainly for some substances, there are those concerns about withdrawal. And there is that need oftentimes for that to be medically managed and supervised. When people go to detox, they have doctors and professionals that are more attuned to how to manage that, how to help someone get through that period. There are more approaches or methods that uh, are aligned with a harm reduction approach, like probably the one that is most well known is methadone maintenance for opiate users. And that's something that generates some controversy because there are those who are coming from more of a abstinence only model who look at that and say, well, that's enabling because it's giving someone their fix. Uh, Instead of heroin, now they're on methadone, and yeah, it's better, but it's keeping someone stuck. It's that they're not doing the work, they're not able to get to that point. The harm reduction approach looks at that and says that, well, heroin and fentanyl, that's really bad and dangerous and ruining this person's life. If we can get them on methadone, then that's something that could be more manageable and really give them back their life in many ways. And again, the critics say that it's keeping them stuck. They're not able to go further. They're not able to get to that point really of autonomy and being able to really get off of the substance. There are those questions and considerations in the context that I am working in an outpatient setting, private practice. I am not meeting with individuals that are at that stage in terms of their progression, their journey, their process with addiction and substance abuse. Somebody who is who is really in the throes of a substance, opiate, uh, cane, methamphetamine, alcohol, oftentimes, if it really is to a point that it's more severe, I refer them to a clinic or somebody who is able to handle more of those medical dimensions to recovery. Should also state that somebody who is going through that should make sure to address those facets. They should not just go cold turkey or even just working with an outpatient therapist. They should make sure that the withdrawal symptoms and the medical elements of it are taken care of.
It's interesting also, I guess, looking at how we viewed addiction, I would say even in the last 20 years, but even in the last 40 years, it's changed so much from how people see addicts. And I think sometimes, there's still a lot of that stigma, but I feel like this kind of work allows us to have a sort of perspective on addiction that we didn't necessarily have before, which I think is really important. I think making that space for somebody to be able to, even as you said, they relapse or maybe they're not sticking to the program as much as they should be or that they thought they could be. And instead of kind of turning it around and saying you've failed, kind of saying, okay, I'm still with you and we're going to move forwards. And I'm really interested to know like how that differs, I guess, from, the other kind of programs. Like I know that, again, I said that a lot of people know AA programs and the 12-step programs. Are there things that you integrate sort of into your approach that are similar to some of those methods, or is it more completely separate and not related at all?
The aspects that AA or NA or SA or any of those community groups provide are really valuable to recovery, and they add a number of dimensions that really are very much lacking in a modern Western society and environment that somebody is in. So having community, having structure, having routine, having accountability, having spirituality, all of those are aspects of what these self-led and community-led groups provide. There really is so much good that they offer. I would say the good outweighs the bad, but there are those that don't feel like that really is as much of a fit. There are, for example, a lot of people who are not religious, not spiritual. They're not comfortable with a lot of those aspects of AA and 12-step programs. There also are those that are not on board with a strictly abstinence-based approach. So there are other alternatives, both 12-step programs. I don't know if they're called 12-step programs, but those analogs that don't really have the emphasis on spirituality, some of those aspects. And there are those also that work from more of a harm reduction approach. So there isn't that expectation of needing to refrain from a substance totally, and not only that substance, but really all psychoactive substances. You have craft, smart recovery. Some of those have those options that are more amenable to people that are looking for something that is more of a harm reduction basis. And going the first part of your question, there really have been changes and shifts in terms of how societally we relate to addiction. The disease model has been a better alternative uh, in many ways than what there was before, which was really a moral model, which looked at somebody struggling with addiction as being defective in character. You are an addict, you are doing a bad thing, you can't control yourself, you just care about pleasure and feeling good than responsibilities or taking care of yourself or your family. And so there was a lot of stigma, there was a lot of shame associated. That makes it hard to get help. It makes it hard to feel like you are worthy of even getting help and to escape from the shame and a lot of the negative emotions that really drive addiction so strongly. In that sense, the disease model helped to reduce a lot of the stigma, but it did it by taking a lot of other things away, like responsibility, agency, really the potential for healing, by saying that you're powerless and you have a disease and there's nothing you can ultimately do to get rid of it. It's just learning how to deal with it. It ends up being very limiting to the person, the causes ultimately that are so much more complex of how addiction develops and then treatment and how you work with it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I wonder also because I feel like, I mean, it was interesting to hear a little bit of the history of how it came from a more moral standpoint to now more disease, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes next. But I wonder also if the disease model also came because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's also a genetic component to addiction and substance use. Is that correct?
Great point. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah, yeah.
So
No, it's just something that occurred to me. So I wonder if that also was a component in labeling it as, a disease, which is something a little bit more medical.
that's definitely a big part of it. I said that it's more complicated because there is no single gene for alcoholism, for any kind of addiction. And that's something that, along with the disease model, has been perpetuated. It really is a myth.
Ooh.
There are predispositions that someone might have that the way that stress or trauma or invalidation or abuse, right, all of those are going to show up in terms of someone's life and experience and ways that they are likely to struggle for different people. That's more likely to take different forms. So for one person, it might be schizophrenia. For another person, it might be depression. Another might be bipolar disorder. For another, it might be addiction. So that can be genetically influenced, but there really is no strictly genetic basis of, well, you have this. And I've heard people say that skips a generation, my grandfather had it, and all of these things, which there is no evidence that backs that up.
So interesting. I'm learning something new every day.
Yeah, I think it's also like you can kind of relate it to other things as well, where some things are nature and some things are nurture. I think if a lot of people are around addiction, honestly, I think it can go either way. You can either, fall into those patterns as well, or you could, do a complete 180 and be completely off it and against it. And I think that like there's so many different factors. It could be like what your surroundings are, how you grew up, who you grew up with, what your coping skills are. Like I feel like there's so many different elements that like go into it.
Yeah, there's nature
Um,
and nurture, and those interact and feed off of each other. The problem that I have with the disease model is that there really is more uh, of looking at it strictly as a physical disease, uh, which is not really taking into account the ways that the nurture, the environment, the early history, the social context, the culture, all of those have an influence in terms of how addiction or any other mental health condition will develop. And we're also learning more about epigenetics, which is it's something which has been really over the last 25 years, but it's gaining more and more recognition of how so much of our makeup physically is not based on what we were born with, so to speak, but that epigenetically, meaning that somewhere down the line, experience impacts our genes. And so certain genes are turned on or turned off, they say, based on having or going through a certain experience. And so not only does the environment impact our psyche, our thoughts, our experience of the world, but it actually changes our bodies and changes them even on a genetic level so that we pass, we can transmit uh, traumas, pain, difficulties, experiences generationally. That's something previously that was uh, not really recognized in a scientific sense. That sounded speculative, or the intergenerational trauma. That's something that was recognized more by some more therapists and from particular schools, that the experience that we have unconsciously is something that we live with that forms our environment, and then it ends up being transmitted to children and to descendants. But that there is now that awareness of how even on a genetic, on a sense of how our bodies are made up, that's something that we do convey and transmit to our descendants.
That's both scary and fascinating, I think, at the same time, because it's something we have absolutely no control over if it's something that comes from people from before us. I also remember, I just thought of this when we were talking before about harm reduction. When it was first introduced to me, I think someone gave me the example of like a seatbelt in a car, where it's like you're driving in a car and you put a seatbelt on, and you don't put a seatbelt on because a seatbelt is going to like not hurt you whatsoever. Like it's not going to, that's not the reason why. Actually, sometimes injuries that you get from car accidents are from the seatbelt. However, it's much better to get injured from a seatbelt than it is to be injured from the effects of the car crash. And I remember like that really stuck with me. Like I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes you have to put something in place that might not be 100% this is going to make you better in this situation, but it is going to help you more than if you weren't doing anything. And I think with a lot of things in life, those kinds of things are really important to know, that like if you're doing more than you were doing yesterday, that's already like a huge step. And I think sometimes that's missed when, again, as people may, have setbacks, or they might have things like that. It could be something that maybe people find hard to bounce back from. So that was just like a side thought, but I guess I want to segue into, I know that addiction is also seen as sort of like a family disease. I've heard that term a lot. People say that, it's not just the person who is addicted that's affected, but it's sort of everybody around. And I'm interested to know, just from your perspective, like how friends or family can support a loved one who's dealing with substance abuse, especially when, their trust has been impacted. Maybe, they've done things in order to get whatever sort of fix they need, and it's gone over the trust of the person that they love.
Certainly, you see how impactful, how devastating it really can be, not just to an individual, but to an entire family. And there is a balance when it comes to being a family member or taking a family as a whole, and how to approach dealing with somebody who is struggling with addiction. And considering the two extremes, on one, you have uh, not being assertive, not speaking up, what would be referred to as enabling, doing things that are going to support, whether explicitly or implicitly, that individual and their struggle and their addiction, right? So if somebody is struggling with substance abuse and isn't working, and their parents are paying for their rent and all their bills, that is going to prolong that person being in a state of, well, I don't have responsibilities. I don't have to deal with any of these consequences. I'm just going to continue to use drugs or alcohol or engage in the addiction. So there's that, and there's also an anxiety and fear that family members feel with uh, somebody who might be in a very fragile place. Maybe they overdose, right? Maybe they're suicidal. So the family is afraid of, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to hurt him or her. I don't want to trigger them in any way. Uh, so they might refrain from setting boundaries, from being able to do things to take care of themselves, and at times say, "This isn't okay. This isn't going to work for me. I'm not going to continue doing this." So that is a one extreme. The other extreme is coming down in a really strong, harsh way, and basically making it a precondition. And I'm not going to have a relationship with you if you continue to do this. If you are going to be an addict, I can really feel to that person that their family is withdrawing, their love is rejecting them, and that can be so wounding and so damaging. The person is obviously going through something very difficult, and then to feel that they are such a failure that their family won't doesn't love them anymore, that's something that really can magnify and activate a whole another layer of pain. So again, it is delicate. There is that balance because there are times that family might have to say, yes, we do love you, but we're not able to be involved in the same way. We need some distance, or this isn't okay for us to be treated in a certain way, or I just need to take a step back for my own sake because I'm feeling too activated. I'm struggling too much with what's coming up in the context of our relationship. And so it does take time to figure out. And they have all sorts of programs. They have 12-step programs, Al-Anon for family members of those struggling with addiction because it really can get complicated and it really can be extremely difficult.
It's so hard to know what's right, and every situation is so individualized and different that getting support for friends and family, I just feel like is also a very important aspect of this. From just like the last couple of minutes, we can also see a lot of the heaviness that comes with working with addiction, and I feel like it can lead you to a lot of dark places, especially if this is something that you're working with on a daily basis. So, can you talk a little bit about what gives you hope in your practice, and how you see the positivity and maybe some success stories that you've seen?
It can get heavy, certainly. The thing that gives me the most hope, I would say, are people that I'm working with and seeing their dedication and willingness to persist and to keep going despite the struggles, the pain, the difficulties that they've been through and that they are continuing to go through. I find that incredibly inspiring and meaningful. And there are people that I've worked with that I've seen how somebody could get to a point where there really is something that shifts. There really is this healing that happens. And that's something, there's no like halo that somebody gets that says, okay, now they're all healed, right? So it's there's different degrees of it, but just seeing how there is that capacity to get to that stage, it's something that does give me a lot of hope and inspiration. Also, additional facet is that many of the ideas, concepts, the frameworks that I talked about that to me feel very helpful and really capture the richness, complexity of addiction, of substance abuse. But those are getting more recognition, and there are uh, more on an organizational level, individually, different uh, theorists, different publications, ways that these ideas are getting disseminated, and that there's a larger awareness that this is a lot more complicated than you just have a chronic brain disease, but that there are experiences, there are ways that the addiction is functioning, and there's a whole history there. And with that framing of it, also comes that, okay, if we can start to tend to and address the underlying pain, then we can really get to that point of seeing the kind of growth that results in that healing and getting to that stage that I mentioned.
I think it's really clear that you're doing like super important work. I think sometimes, maybe the path that maybe could be easier is saying, it's easier for me to work with people who, I can just say this is the problem and this is the solution. But this is, I think, much more complex than that. And it goes into so many different facets of mental health. And I don't know, I think it's just really important to hear your perspective, especially when it's one that isn't necessarily the standard way of this is how we treat addiction. And if anybody's listening to this now and they want to learn a little bit more about how they can get in touch with you, what's the best way for people to contact you and start treatment if they feel that they maybe want to start a change in their lives?
The best way would be to go on my website, mishaanpsychotherapy.com. And I have a contact form you can fill out. I have some other information about addiction and other specialties that I have. So you can learn more about my work and how I might be able to help, and if we're aligned in terms of what you're looking for, and reach out.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I can't wait to see what you do next. And hopefully, we'll be able to have you on the show again, and we'll be talking about more interesting things that you've learned throughout your time in your practice.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.